Good morning and welcome to our second webinar for first responder leaders. I just wanted to point out how fitting it is to be having this webinar today on Bell Let's Talk Day, and how great it is to be having a conversation about mental health at this time. Today's topic is surviving COVID-19, lessons on what we have lived and learned. My name is Trudy Rondeau, and I'm the chair of the BC First Responder Mental Health Committee. I'm also really excited to be the moderator for all 6 webinars in this series. For those who attended last week's webinar, the next minute or two will sound familiar as I repeat some information provided previously. However, there are enough attendees only attending specific sessions and not the whole series that I want to repeat our committee's introduction. Since its creation in 2015, the BC First Responders Mental Health Committee has worked to support positive mental health by creating and sharing best practices through resources, awareness campaigns, training, education, and supports that first responders, their communities, and their leaders need. The committee includes representatives from law enforcement, firefighting, paramedics, and dispatchers, as well as the provincial government and WorkSafe BC, and is proud to have shared its resources with organizations across Canada to promote awareness and to attack the issue of mental health stigma head on. In January 2019, the committee successfully hosted its first 2-day BC First Responders Mental Health Conference in Richmond, BC. 350 delegates came in person to listen and learn at the sold-out conference, with 98% of attendees saying that they would attend another future BC First Responders Mental Health Conference. An encore was planned for January 2021. Fast forward to today, where the plans for the 2021 event had to be reimagined. And as have many other organizations over the past year, we switched to a no-charge virtual format, allowing us to accommodate many more attendees than we could have imagined hosting in person. However, the goal remained the same: to deliver an event that would be of greatest value to this community. Because as perhaps in no greater time than before now, the challenges related to promoting positive mental health in your community have never been felt so acutely. Today's session is 90 minutes long. We'll hear from a panel of first responder leaders and mental health experts on what they've learned from their own experiences. The open dialogue with the speaker panel will be followed by a question and answer period consisting of both moderated and audience-driven questions. So please, I encourage you to use the Q&A feature, not the chat, to submit your questions throughout the panel discussion. Don't wait until the end. And please use the thumbs up feature if you see a question you like. Now, there are approximately 1,000 who registered to attend this webinar, so we may not have an opportunity to get to all your questions, but we do have a team member actively curating the questions during the session so that we can address the most common themes. In terms of our audience today, there was interest to participate from across various first responder communities and from across the world. 70% of you indicated you're in a leadership role. 37% are from law enforcement, 32% from firefighting, 15% from paramedicine, 4% from emergency dispatch, and 11% of you fit into the other category, which includes clinicians, therapists, chaplains, and members of local government. 51% of you are from the Lower Mainland, but we do have almost 84 people from other provinces in Canada and several people from the US and the UK. Before I move into introducing today's speakers, I would like to acknowledge that we're hosting this session from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Tsawwassen peoples. Also, please note that these sessions are being recorded and will be posted to our website, bcfirstrespondermentalhealth.com, soon, so you'll have access to the information shared at a later date. Now, some more on our subject for today: surviving COVID-19, lessons on what we have lived and learned. As you listen in on the open dialogue, you'll hear practical recommendations first responder leaders can follow to protect the mental health of workers in your organization. By the end of the session, you'll have learned about how leadership can support staff and promote mental health during the pandemic, and have heard real people with real stories to better understand the impact the pandemic has had on mental health. Finally, I want to encourage you to be mindful for the next 90 minutes. You've made the commitment to attend, and you're here now. Please put your distractions aside and focus on the information that's being shared with you. Our goal is that by the end of the session, you'll have some practical information to help you in your leadership role. On to our speakers. I'm very pleased to introduce first, Superintendent Andrew Chan. Superintendent Andrew Chan began his career with the Vancouver Police Department in 1999 and spent his first 12 years as a patrol constable and as a tactical operator with the emergency response team. Promoted through the years, by 2019, he was assigned to the Human Resources section as the officer in charge, where he managed 14 units, including the VPD's Pandemic Working Group and the Employee Wellness Unit. In 2020, he was promoted to superintendent and is currently assigned as the Disciplinary Authority Superior Services Superintendent. Welcome, Andrew. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mark Davies. Dr. Davies received his PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Alberta in 1995. Dr. Davies has extensive experience working with trauma and first responders, specifically providing psychological services for individuals, facilitating critical incident stress debriefings, leading seminars and workshops, and acting as a consultant to first responder agencies. Most notably, the resilience program he developed has been used by many first responder agencies, and he's trained over 3,000 first responders on it. Welcome, Mark. Next, I'd like to introduce Jane Hamilton. Jane began her interest in pre-hospital care in 2001 when she became a volunteer member of the Ness Lake Fire Department in Prince George and obtained her EMA license as a first responder. This sparked her interest in emergency medicine, leading to a career with the BC Emergency Health Services Ambulance Paramedics of BC in 2008 as a primary care paramedic. Early in her career, the patient setting was dynamic as it involved air, land, and sea responses along BC's north coast. In 2014, she transitioned to working in metropolitan settings, and by 2019 became a member of the Critical Incident Support Peer Team. In January 2020, she began her new role as an advanced care paramedic stationed in Richmond, BC. Nice to see you, Jane. Next, I'd like to introduce Ryan Stewart. Ryan began his career as a firefighter with the District of North Vancouver in 2006. 2011 was an important year as he joined the department's Critical Incident Stress Team and was elected Vice President of the District of North Vancouver Firefighters Union. In his dual role as a CIS team member and as a union executive, to which he was later elected as president in 2016, he deals with a multitude of firefighter mental health issues, from leading critical incident diffusings and debriefings to handling the workplace files of members with longer-term mental health challenges. Currently, Ryan is meeting the challenge, along with his fellow District of North Vancouver firefighters, to respond to and work in the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Ryan. So I'd like to start today's session off with getting to know our speakers a little bit more. So I'm going to start with Andrew. Andrew, could you tell us a little bit more about what your role has been during COVID?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Trudy, and thanks for having me. Yeah, throughout the COVID pandemic, I think my role has evolved like many of ours had. Within the VPD, our response started at the back end of January 2020, and it evolved through March and then throughout the rest of the year. Initially, I was the officer in charge of the Human Resources section. I became one of the silver commanders with our departmental operations center as we expanded our COVID-19 response. And as we ramped kind of up and down throughout the pandemic, I transitioned into the officer in charge of the Pandemic Working Group. So just managing the team of sworn and civilian members that supported our staff throughout the pandemic.
Excellent, thank you. And so I assume that there was a change in responsibilities for you then during the pandemic.
There were. I mean, I did maintain my role as the HR inspector, but a big part of my duties, especially during the height of the pandemic, getting into April and May when things were really ramping up, was strictly dedicated 6 or 7 days a week to providing support to the pandemic working group and the departmental operations center.
Excellent, thank you. And can you talk a little bit about what your own coping strategies have been during COVID?
Yeah, for sure. I think like many of us, I think it's evolved a bit. Quite honestly, throughout the beginning of the pandemic, in March and April, there wasn't much. There was really, it was work 7 days a week, 16 to 18 hours a day. There wasn't much time for outside of work coping strategies. Things end up catching up. And like many of us, our coping strategies evolve. I found it important to stay healthy, keep physically active, spending time with family, and throughout the summer when we were able to do a bit of socializing, trying to socialize within the rules for sure.
Excellent, thank you. I'd like to move on to Mark Davies now. Mark, what has your role been during COVID-19? If you could please unmute yourself. Sorry, Mark, I'm not hearing your audio. Could you please unmute yourself?
Sorry, Trudy, my apologies. Again, thanks for having me. You can hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Sorry about that. Yeah, just my role has gotten a little bit more intense than anything. It's evolved in that I'm seeing people a lot on distance. I still will see the really severe trauma clients that I see personally. I'll go into the office, but a lot I'm doing by Zoom, and a lot by phone. And then all my training, my face-to-face resilience training kind of really got put on hold. And there was this gap in the middle where it's like, we don't know what we're doing, and sort of the stuff I was doing with first responder agencies really got put on hold. And now it's beginning to really ramp up with as far as consulting particularly goes. So what strategies can we put in place to help people facing not just first responder duties, but now add COVID on top of that.
Thank you. And can you talk a little bit about how your practice has changed during COVID?
I just, again, just more intense. It's just gotten much more intense, and just doing a lot more distance and a lot more. I've really learned a lot about technology in the last year for sure. Excellent.
And I think you mentioned to us previously that you've actually, due to the pandemic, cut down on the number of patients you've seen. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, in my own mental health, even before the pandemic, I have a chronically ill daughter, which puts a lot of stress at home. And just seeing first responders and trauma, I realized about 3 years ago that it was beginning to really hit my own mental health. And so I cut back, and kind of fortunately, the consulting and the training picked up on the other side. So that part became less intense, and it was much, much better for my own mental health for sure.
Excellent. Can you talk about, I don't know that we often think about therapists having their own coping skills, but what kind of coping skills have you put in place during the pandemic?
Oh, my therapists need it just as much as anybody else for sure. For me, I would say that the number one thing with COVID has been a very, very disciplined approach. My family, not just because of COVID, but because of my daughter's illness, we've really been jammed together. So we take a really disciplined approach about games night. We read to each other, movie night, and then we have a kind of everybody on their own night. So I'm very structured about my own self-care.
Excellent. Sounds like great advice for many of us.
Yeah, just to have those nights, we're doing this, we're going to do that, we're going to do that. Really, that structure has been really helpful for us.
Perfect, thank you. Now, Jane, how about you? What's your role been during COVID, and has this been a change for you?
Well, in some ways, everything's changed. In other ways, everything's the same. So my role is an advanced care paramedic. For the benefit of those that aren't in the service in BC, I work on a unit that layers in with our primary care units. We deal primarily with the most critically ill, high acuity patients in the Lower Mainland and elsewhere in the province if you're in an advanced care role. So that hasn't changed. My day-to-day shift pattern hasn't changed. I've been very fortunate, to still have a job and still have a purpose throughout this whole pandemic. I know a lot of people haven't been able to stay the same. So, that's been nice to have that regularity. But in a lot of ways, everything's changed. Like I said, we've now got the addition of PPE. Our work processes have completely changed. Our clinical medical program guidance on how to do business, I guess, has been completely altered. While the medicine doesn't change, our practice has dramatically as a result of this. So yeah, it's kind of odd. A lot of things are just as they were, but it's an alternate reality from where we were a year ago, for sure.
Yeah, I really like how you talked about having a purpose. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's in a lot of ways, when we go home, we're living the same COVID reality as the rest of the population. So it's kind of nice, instead of sitting at home, doing what COVID guidelines dictate, which is stay home, don't socialize, don't go out unless necessary, that kind of thing. It was really nice to be able to, with a purpose and, with allowance, go out and do our job and do something that seemed like it was helping in a way. So it was, it was a little bit of purpose when it seemed like there was nothing else to kind of contribute, I guess.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And can you talk a little bit about some of your own coping skills during COVID?
So like everybody, a lot of our coping and a lot of my coping mechanisms have been kind of eaten into with COVID restrictions. I used to be a swimmer, so that's, had a big dent in it, obviously, with all of the restrictions lately. So I just try to stay active as much as I can, get out of the house where I can. I do a lot of artwork, a lot of reading, and I also got myself into therapy this year, which has been a huge help as well.
Yeah, excellent. And it's rare sometimes for people to talk about their own therapy. Is there any kind of stigma attached to that for you?
There definitely has been in the past. The way I approach it now is not the same as the way I would have a couple of years ago. I definitely, I think any first responder would agree there is still stigma out there in the workplace around getting therapy, getting help. But I think if COVID has proven anything is that we can't afford to allow that anymore, I guess. So, everybody comes into this job with their own amount of trauma, personal and otherwise, and then you accrue varying amounts of trauma working as a first responder, and everybody's different that way. But what I found was what I could have maybe dealt with for another 5, 10, however many years under normal circumstances, the pandemic made impossible to bear for, I'm going to say 6 months. So I think stigma does exist. We need to recognize it, but it's also something we need to not tolerate anymore and just normalize talking about it.
I think that's an excellent point, and that's part of our campaign, Share It, Don't Wear It, is about normalizing the need for mental health supports, and whether that be through therapy or your own coping skills, whatever it may be. Ryan, I'd like to turn it over to you. Can you talk a little bit about what your role has been during COVID?
Sure. So my role has been to represent the interests of men and women that are in the front lines on the fire trucks in the district of North Vancouver. And so what that means is I've been looking after issues related to their health and safety, their mental health concerns, staffing concerns, contractual concerns, just really making sure that they're getting everything they need and are looked after from their perspectives.
Excellent. And so has this been a change for you?
It's been a pretty dramatic change for us in North Vancouver. The COVID story goes back to early March. And I think in the fire service, we have a culture where we sit around the table and discuss global issues and how we would respond. Because when you see the news and you see a plane crash, you see a disaster, there's a firefighter responding to that. And I think we're all cut from the same cloth that could be any of us. And so So we look at these opportunities to analyze what we're doing. And we saw COVID hit in China. You could see a very high level of personal protective equipment being used. You could see streets being sprayed down. You could see apartment buildings shut with people basically being locked inside. And so it was still kind of an issue from over there, but eventually we heard that it had hit into Toronto. And then sure enough, I believe it was March 9th, where we heard there was a fatality across the street from our #1 station at the Lynn Valley Care Center. So I started getting calls from firefighters there saying, it's here, it is in North Vancouver, it's across the street. From that, it started to steamroll. We started to then get members that were overseas saying what's happening. I'm over in Australia, I'm in Mexico, what's going on with COVID. And then my role through the union, I'm also work on the fire trucks. And shortly after that, I responded to a call where it was a regular call, nothing abnormal. I walked into the room and the lady that had called for her husband was guiding us in. She goes, I don't know what's wrong with this person or with my husband. He was fine. He was fine like earlier today. And we walk in and this person their lungs were full of fluid. This person was struggling to survive. And the lady had said, he was working with clients this whole week up until today. I don't know what's going on. And it was this eureka moment of, oh my God, this is exploding. It's going to be everywhere. And from that moment, we talked to our crews and it was just you could tell this was about to get very, very real. And it started off, COVID started off as a sprint. I describe it as a sprint at the start. And now we've been in a marathon up until this day.
Wow, there's so much in what you just said there to unpack. I guess one thing I wanted to comment on is, first responders are supposed to be this stereotype of a stoic, stalwart kind of individual, but everything you've just described there sounds so scary. Were you scared?
I don't know if the scared is the right term, but it was definitely acknowledging that we are about to get into something very big or potentially big at that time. We didn't know how fast this spread. We didn't really know how dangerous it was. It was, I wouldn't describe it as scared, but it was ready to tackle something big.
Right. So the awareness there that this is something huge coming at you. Okay, perfect. All right, I'd like to turn it over to our group now. So just jumping off something that Ryan just said, that this was a sprint that's turned into a marathon. Andrew, can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, he hit the nail on the head there for sure. This has absolutely been a sprint at the beginning. We're into the marathon phase, and it seems like we're into an ultra marathon right now, going into the 1+ year mark. What I would say for us here within the Vancouver Police Department is, we were fortunate to have a great team of sworn and civilian staff that we were able to put into key positions early on in the pandemic. But what was really important as this turned into a marathon, I'd like to say it was a bit more of a marathon relay race. So we were able to really layer those key individuals to ensure there was redundancy. Because you never know when someone was going to be able to go down. We need to have a backup. So that was really important for us to have that great team of sworn and civilian professionals to be there to support our staff, because they're the ones that are out there on the front lines.
Yeah, I mean, I love the analogy that we're building here, the sprint to a marathon, and layering in that concept of a relay race so that you've got people to support you and back each other up. Jane, can you sort of relate this to your experience? You talked earlier about how, you may have been able to handle things for 6 to 10 more years, but COVID changed everything for you. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways we had a very similar experience in paramedicine. When this first started, it was sort of like having a door slammed in our face, and the door being on our old way of doing business. So we went overnight from conducting business the way we used to waking up the next morning in full PPE for every single call. So it was very abrupt and very intense at the beginning when we overnight transitioned into this. And it was very much a sprint at the beginning. You know, there was about, I'm going to say 2-3 months there where it was just absolutely nonstop. We had upwards of 15 practice updates a day to keep up with. You know, you would just think you had a grip on how to do business after reading one, and you'd go out and do a call and come back and there'd be 3 more, and things had changed. So things have kind of settled down a little bit. It's more the marathon phase. But yeah, it was definitely can relate to that analogy of, you know, it was go, go, go. And now it's just this very long, drawn out way of doing business, right? Like it's not normal, but we're kind of used to it.
Yeah.
So.
Jane, in some of our previous conversations, you've talked about how one of the things that's enabled you to get through this last year is your team. Can you talk a little bit about teamwork?
Yeah, so first thing I want to say is my coworkers are my heroes. I think that the biggest motto that we've all had is the people that are going to get us through this is each other. You know, it's not, and it's no slag against anybody, it's not our leadership, it's not the patients, it's not anything else, it's each other that's going to get each other through this. And I think that's been a big thing that we've all hung on to. I've really relied on my colleagues to help with all of the changes, and I try to help them with all the changes as well. One person simply can't keep up with all of the information coming at us and all of the practice updates and all of the nuances of, you know, trying to be effective and be a good clinician with your patients. No one person can do all of this and absorb all of it at once. It's a team effort. And work is sort of like a family in a sense. You know, you can't go home, you can't relate all of this stuff to your family. You can tell them a certain amount of it, but there's only so much that they can actually relate to, and there's only so much that we want to share with them. So it's important to have this work family and these people that you share this experience with on a daily basis. So having them there has been really valuable.
Thank you. Ryan, firefighters are typically, you know, seen in a team and considered in a team element. Can you talk a little bit about how that team dynamic has supported you through this period?
Yeah, I think in our line of work, we have very close bonds, and I think it's made it easier as a coping mechanism for mental health that when we're together, we're able to support each other. We're able to create an environment that we can thrive amongst ourselves. So the teamwork, I mean, it's been quite amazing to see some of the things our men and women have done stepping up to this issue and tackling this issue and adapting to it. I mean, I understand everybody's frustrations on how much information has been coming at them and how much change. And I think there's been a very good attitude to go, okay, this is what we're doing now. Okay, that's changed this afternoon. This is what we're doing now. And to just keep adapting. So having a strong team where you can adapt together has been definitely beneficial.
Excellent. Mark, I wonder if you could jump in sort of from the clinical perspective. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of teams and support?
Yeah, if we're talking about a marathon, we're on mile 22 and the crowds have thinned out. You know, when you start running a marathon, there's all these crowds and they cheer you, and anybody who's run a marathon, they know how much that cheering is important. And there was the pot banging, and there was the, yay for first responders. That's kind of really thinned out a lot. And now the watering stations, in other words, your outlets that you use, your social outlets, your hobby outlets are really curtailed. So even the watering stations are kind of getting further and further away from each other. So it's really a hard part of the race. And I think what everybody's saying is first responders really need to change the way they think about how they're approaching this. There's two things. First responders, because of the work they do, focus on the negative. That's just because they don't do a lot. I mean, law enforcement goes and looks after bad things. Fire, same thing. Paramedics. So that they kind of trained to look at what's wrong with this situation so we can go in. So they're going to have to learn to change to figure out what do we do well and really, really accentuate celebrating that. And that's the second part of it is first responders can be very competitive, very type A, and now kind of changing the whole idea that the race isn't for me to win. It's we're all in it together, and what we're not trying to win it. We're all trying to cross it. We're all trying to get through this together. So I think there's a couple of changes, and so the whole idea of encouragement, which sounds really soft, but is absolutely critical. There's research to suggest through Harvard showed research that unit cohesion in the military was a negative predictor of PTSD by 20%. So in other words, if you were on a unit in the military that really had each other's back, that were really encouraging, that were kind of in the race together, if we're going to use the metaphor, your risk of getting PTSD was down by 20%, and that's just huge. So there's a couple of changes that need to go on, and it sounds like, as my colleagues here are saying, those changes are starting to take place, which is really encouraging, actually.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for that information. I mean, that's really an incredible statistic and a very worthwhile study. Andrew, can you talk a little bit about communication during this period and how things may have changed, or what some of the pros and cons have been about communication?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as we all know, communication is key. Generally, when we have disasters or major incidents, one of the first things that goes wrong and that gets brought up in debriefs is communication breakdown. I can say that we've tried our absolute best to ensure that we've leveraged all different types of communication platforms to get that crucial information out early on throughout the pandemic. And it's been a learning process throughout this past year. We were able to leverage some new different platforms on disseminating that information. And that's twofold, not just the technical information on how to respond to the calls with certain PPE and different guidelines on legal authorities, the technical part of the job, but also the disseminating information on how we can ensure that we're supporting our staff as well. All the peer supports, employee wellness things as well. Whereas previously we would be able to do that face to face, we had to find new ways to get that information out, especially when some people are, were working remotely or out on the field, how to get that information out to the staff members.
And how have you really sort of measured the success of that communication? How do you know what you're doing is working?
Yeah, I think that's a tough question to measure. I think a lot of the feedback came from our peer outreach team, our peer support team. I have to say, within Vancouver, we have an excellent team, sworn and civilian members in our employee wellness unit that handle everything from physical ailments, mental health, wellness, the whole gamut. They do an amazing job, and they're the kind of eyes and ears out there for our sworn civilian members, and they can provide real-time feedback to us to see, what's working, what's not, and what we can amend to make it better for our first responders out on the road.
Excellent, great. So I think that's a great thing you've brought up is peer support and peer support teams. Ryan, can you talk a little bit about peer support in the fire department?
Yeah, we've been fortunate that we tackled this issue culturally quite some time ago. So we were starting to build the building blocks of resiliency within our department. And I think it's been very helpful that now that this pandemic has come, I think our members are aware of mental health issues and things to do to make it better for themselves. We had a Resilient Minds program, which if members watching aren't aware of what that program is we've looked at mental health, not just from a critical incident of a singular horrific event, but we've looked at a career in emergency services where we're going to bad events all the time. And what does that slowly do to you? And what happens if you are now dealing with a loved one or a brother dealing with cancer? And what does that do to your mental health? And we never really talked about it. We never thought about it before. Now that we have, I think it's culturally there that, okay, we know this is an issue. We know there's going to be some impacts from this. What can we do? We know some coping mechanisms. unfortunately, COVID has been hard that it's hit a lot of the coping mechanisms for our members. So we're dealing with it, but we definitely have some challenges on how best to deal with coping mechanisms for mental health.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of ironic in this period when really we want to be using all the coping mechanisms we have accessible to us. Many of the coping mechanisms, such as, you know, going to the gym, socializing with people, and the irony, right, that at this time we need those things and we can't have access to those things.
Absolutely. I mean, being able to connect with people and just be out and in public and part of the good parts of life, instead of just dealing with, you know, the trauma of emergency responses and what we've described in this panel is just sort of the doom and gloom side of things. You know, I think it is important for mental health that you are part of society and all the good things that happen. So COVID's been challenging in that it's taken that coping mechanism away. So we've had to find ways to adapt.
Yeah, thank you. And Jane, in our previous conversations, you've talked a little bit about some of your coping skills, and one particular was gratitude. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so through some of my training with the critical incident stress team, practicing gratitude daily was one of the coping mechanisms brought up, and I've done it for a couple of years now. I find it's helpful. I just set a timer on my phone. It just buzzes in my pocket, same time every single day. And if I'm busy and I come back to my phone later, I'll see it on there. And I just take, 30 seconds just to count off what I'm grateful for that day. It doesn't have to be anything major. It can be the smallest thing in the world. I'm happy I have PPE today. It doesn't matter. But it makes a huge difference on my outlook. And I've noticed a huge difference since I started doing that, just on how I view the world. It's been a lot of talk with my colleagues here about, the doom and gloom outlook. I feel like that really put a dent in that for me. Really made my outlook a lot more positive.
Yeah, we had, for those of you who caught last week's webinar, we had Dr. Vivian Lee speaking to us, and she talked about coping skills and self-care strategies, and really reinforced that it can be literally a minute. You don't have to set aside an hour for massage therapy or whatever it may be. You can literally set aside 1 minute, and doing something like Jane's talked about here, just practicing gratitude can make all the difference. Mark, can you talk a little bit about the science behind gratitude?
Yeah, absolutely. I also practice gratitude. When I do my resilience seminar, I have 30 people in the room, and I'll ask everybody to see who's wearing black. And so they'll look around the room and they see who's wearing black, and then they face me and I go, well, tell me who was wearing red. And they can't. And it's because they were looking at the black, right? And so it's unbelievable, the power of attention. So whatever we don't pay attention to, we will not take in, and we won't remember for the rest of our lives. So when first responders, their business is almost always trauma, stress. There's an incredible amount of negativity. It's also a very rich life. It's a very rich life, but you can get so sucked into just looking at what's wrong, and it becomes part of the culture. And so then when you do in a very disciplined way an exercise like practicing gratitude, so you write out 3 things every night before you go to bed, what you're really grateful for, all of a sudden your brain completely shifts. It completely does something different, the way it understands the world. Jane, right off the bat, was thankful about the fact that she has a job as a first responder. Right now, compare that to the first responder who goes, I'm so done with this, I can't do this anymore, right? So I understand that, and you can empathize and even sympathize with that. But ultimately, what are the good things about it? What, putting on PPEs, oh my goodness, do I have to put those on again? Yeah, they protect you. Isn't that wonderful that they invented something that protects me? So how we look at things is maybe the most important factor in how we experience life. And so gratitude is just a disciplined way of looking at things.
Excellent. I think that's really important advice. And I know, speaking personally, I started off yesterday grumpy. And at about 10 o'clock, I thought to myself, you know, the rest of the day will be dictated by my attitude. And I have control over my attitude. So how can I switch things up to make the rest of this day be a wonderful day? And it was a really conscious method of sort of dealing with my brain and switching things around. So I like what you've talked about there, this sort of conscious effort.
There's an excellent, I would highly recommend a CBC article by Dr. Chowdhury, who worked in my old hospital where I interned, the Royal Alec. He's an ICU intern, and he writes about COVID over Christmas. And at the end of the article, he says, I've come to one conclusion, and that's hope really matters. And maybe it matters because it's the one thing I really truly can control as to whether I hope or not. And then he talks about how that unit begins to engender hope among each other and how they've been very intentional about that. And I think that's another critical dimension to getting through this marathon we're in.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Andrew, a question for you. So personally, what's been the most challenging aspect of leading people during this pandemic?
Yeah, so I think I touched on it a little bit earlier, and this is going to be a recurring kind of theme here, but communication. I think, you know, ensuring that the leaders at multi-levels within the department, you know, at the practitioner level, the supervisor, the management, the executive level, are able to effectively communicate out to our staff, both those policies, procedures, directives, things that we need to do on a day-to-day basis just to do our baseline jobs as police officers. But also everything COVID related. How can we do it safely? Our PPE practices, legal authorities, you know, everything to do with COVID as well. So I think that was a real tough thing because at the best of times, communication, you know, within a larger police department or other organization can be strained. It can be difficult to make sure that message gets, you know, down to those frontline responders. Especially with throughout COVID over the past year, it's been challenging for sure, ensuring that message is able to get right down to that frontline sworn or civilian staff member to ensure that the right message is there and that they had easy access to all the information that they needed.
Thank you. One of our speakers last week talked about maybe not knowing what the right message is, right? And sort of putting yourself out there that you don't know everything at this point in time, and essentially as a leader being a bit vulnerable. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, we were fortunate because early on we had some professionals kind of tell us, listen, we haven't gone through something like this before, this type of pandemic in our time anyway. So the message that we really did try and convey to all our staff very early on is that things are going to change. You know, the information that we have right now is the best information that we have currently, but be prepared for a change. And we've kind of heard it before. Jane kind of alluded to it. Things change from 8 o'clock in the morning. We would push out directives and policies and procedures. And then at noon, something else would change. Maybe a legal authority or medical advice, things would change again. And we scrambled to try and get policies, procedures, documents, you know, memos out to all our staff members. But, you know, what was really important was just really early on saying, just so everyone would have a realistic expectation to say that this is the best information we have right now, but be prepared because we need to be, you know, flexible and be able to adapt.
Thank you. Jane, can you talk about leadership a little bit in terms of the pandemic and what that's meant for you and what's worked and maybe what hasn't worked?
I mean, it's meant a lot of things. I'm a frontline worker, so I have leadership over me that I answer to at the end of the day. And I also am in a leadership role when it comes to my actual work, when I'm doing calls. So as far as the, ambulance management leadership, it's been an evolving process. We've all experienced a lot of change with it. When the pandemic started, we were getting multiple updates, multiple changes throughout the day. And I think Andrew mentioned it really well when he said, nobody's done this before. There's nobody that's gone through a pandemic like this in their career in emergency services. We don't have an old grizzled paramedic sitting in the back of the bay that we can go ask about how they dealt with this. we're it. So we're figuring this out as we go. And I have to give leadership some credit. They might not have always got it right, but they did try. And there was a lot to keep up with. So I think keeping that in mind, they've come a long way, and they put a lot of effort into try to support their staff and try to keep up with information. It's a really difficult process in a huge organization when you've got a lot of people working from home as well. I think we've got 4,600, give or take, frontline paramedics in BCEHS. So if you think about the support staff that goes along with that, you know, and a lot of them are working from home, a lot of working from the office, trying to coordinate that into a meaningful message and meaningful leadership for your frontline staff has got to be a massive undertaking. So they've really evolved with that, and I have to give them credit for that. As far as leadership on the streets in my role, it's been, I mean, it's been difficult. A lot of our communication has been cut into with PPE. So when I'm dealing with calls now, just communicating with my team, I might not just be working with my own team with other paramedics, but I might be working with frequently firefighters, police, and who knows what other agencies. And when I'm wearing a respirator, I can't communicate effectively. It's hard to understand us when we're wearing that kind of gear. So to try and mobilize a team into an effective unit that can accomplish a goal, you know, it was difficult before when people could see my face and hear me speaking normally. You know, add, you know, how many layers of PPE to that, it's become a real challenge. So you know, I don't know how I'm doing at it, but I think our workforce in general, paramedics have done a really good job of trying to rise up to the challenge of trying to make communication work under these circumstances. So in that sense, you know, we're working on our leadership all the time. So I hope it's meeting the bar that way.
Yeah, and it really sounds like leadership through this period is evolving, just like everything else. The knowledge that we've got around the science is evolving. Ryan, can you talk a little bit about leadership in the fire service and what's been working and maybe what hasn't been working?
Yeah, I think when we think of leadership, we think of it in a traditional role of an organizational chart with a leader at the top and a pyramid shape where it flows down to the workforce at the bottom. That workforce is working under the directives of the leader and trying to meet that leader's wants and needs. And I think flipping that upside down into what's called servant leadership, where a leader is working for the wants and needs of the workforce, because ultimately the product that we're putting out in the public, that the public is demanding, is going to make or break on the success of that workforce out in the field. So really from a leader's standpoint, our success is their success. So it's finding what do they need, what's going to make them excel, what's going to make them thrive, what's going to make them resilient, and trying to get them those things. In the process of it, I think there's going to be some humility. You got to be humble. We're not going to know all the answers. I'm going to let out a trade secret here that firefighters don't know everything. I know we think we do, and we'll tell all the other services out there that we do, but we don't. So it's really, it's listening, it's caring, trying to get the answers and doing our best for our workers.
Thank you. So humility, listening, caring. Mark, do you have anything to add in terms of leadership, particularly through a pandemic?
Yeah, I think Ryan really nailed it. The author of one of the best-selling business books of all time is Good to Great. His most unexpected discovery was that universally the companies that went from good to great had the people at the top were incredibly humble. That if something went right, it was because of the people that was working for that individual. If something went wrong, it was the CEO took it on. And so that whole servant leadership, building trust, and the second part of communication is listening, right? It's not just being able to get the message out, it's being able to hear back. And there's never been a more critical time to build trust, which is really hard with this kind of stress, because I don't know how you build mental health in an organization without trust. And that's a long, slow, hard process to walk the talk, to really have people's best interests and needs, and to be gracious to one another. Absolutely critical in this period.
Yeah, I think that there's, again, so much to unpack in what you just said there. I think building trust is really key. Andrew, can you talk a little bit about building trust in the police department?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I alluded to it a bit before. You know, we were so fortunate to have such a strong team of sworn civilian members in our employee wellness unit, and they give a lot of credibility to our members on the front line. They're, you know, an open door where our members can really go there and just unload on everything that's happening. And everything is confidential with our employee wellness unit and our peer support teams. Just ensuring that we're able to provide those frontline members with the tools, the resources, and all the support they need to ensure that, you know, those men and women on the front lines are able to do their jobs. At the end of the day, if our leadership can do that, which I think, you know, we've made mistakes in the past and we learn from them. But I think for sure the supports are there to ensure that those frontline members can have all the tools, you know, that they need to get the job done and take care of themselves as well.
Thank you. Mark, I wonder, can you think of some people who are actually thriving during this period, and how is that happening for them?
I think thriving is a relative term. I think it's hard to thrive in mile 22, but to run a good race, I think that's a different thing. One of the things that I'm known for, the resilience training I do, and I think we need to be really cautious about how much we ask of people at this time with regards to mental health. My own feeling is, at this time, if we say, well, we really should optimize mental health and things should be really good, I think you're putting almost a greater burden on people. So really, I think we're just trying to hold on to what we've got and not get so bad that when this finally does ease up a little bit and we can back life, that we can rest and repair. A marathon takes a lot out of a person. So certainly there are people who are managing this incredibly well. And again, what they're the number one commonality that people are managing this incredibly well is they're disciplined in an intentional way about nurturing themselves and the relationships that they can be in. So we talk about physical distancing, social distancing, but really what we need to be talking about is physical distancing. We need social connection at this time, because that's a critical aspect of getting through this.
Thank you. And for those of you who caught our webinar last week, we had Dr. Greg Anderson talking about a study that they've done with first responders in COVID and showing indicators that depression and anxiety are increasing during this period. And really kind of wanting us all to think about, what are we going to do as the pandemic switches into its next phase? And I don't know if it's appropriate to say ends, but things will change again. And what supports are we putting in place now to make sure that we're giving people that, as Mark has said, that rest and recovery period, because we can't keep running a marathon in perpetuity. So yes, thank you. Okay. So we're going to move to some questions that we've had from the audience at this point. So the first question is for you, Ryan. Excuse me. As a union leader, what are the additional challenges you have faced during this pandemic, and how has that affected how you support and represent your members through these difficult times?
Well, I think in labor relations, there's always a challenge that you're working on one side of interest and the employer is working on another side of an interest. And good labor relations is somewhat of a tug of war, where when it's most effective is when both are pulling at sort of the same strength level and it's balanced. That allows a little bit of conversation to start opening up because we're at equal footings. So I think when we're in this tug of war and we look at it as a one-dimensional sort of struggle, to open it up and think of it in more of a two-dimensional way, that, okay, we can have this tension on the line, we can both be doing our roles, but while we're pulling, let's walk sideways together over to a goal that we can achieve, something that we both want, something that's good for everyone, good for the workforce. So I think it's being able to still maintain your role, but then to try and find objectives that you can work together without having to necessarily concede your your positions.
That sounds like very sage advice, and having that common goal can be so important to achieving mutual success, really. Yeah, thank you. Mark, question for you. First off, is a comment on how much I appreciate Dr. Davies' vulnerability. And next is the question. How important do you think it is for leaders to share about their own challenges with their staff and set an example of why we should share it and not wear it?
Right. Yeah, I was at a meeting not too long ago where there was a lot of mistrust between management and the frontline workers, which can often happen. And there was a lot of tension in the room. And the frontline workers were trying to do an initiative, and there was some pushback from management and just some accusation. It got pretty heated in the room, and some accusation, a lot of mistrust. And in the middle of it, the senior officer there just kind of opened up, I think in a very appropriate way. He said, like, it's not just you guys. Like, I go home, I worry about my kids too. And his voice started to falter a little bit. And he said, I've been working 16-hour days, and whether you believe it or not, we at management, we really do worry about you. You might not always think that. We carry you home. We ache for you guys. We're scared for you. And it was just like it really broke the mold. It really changed. And his eyes were moist. And in an instant, the room changed, because they didn't see it as a him. They didn't see him with the stripes on his shoulder. They saw him as a us. And again, we need humility and vulnerability that's appropriate to leadership, but it just goes so far when you can be human in an appropriate way in front of those you lead.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that concept. Thank you for sharing the example. We've got a great question that's come in that's actually for the panel. I think I'm going to start with you, Jane. So we've talked a lot about teamwork. Has anyone experienced some divisions within the team? So for example, the degree to which people adhere to safety protocols, and how will that impact the team culture?
I think anybody who's wearing PPE and having to adhere to some of the safety guidelines right now in first responder land, I think we're all seeing some variance in, people's adherence to, perfect guidelines. It's definitely, when you're working in medicine, I think there's possibly a bit less of it, just because we have, all we're seeing are infectious people. It's, police may go out and they may, be dealing with people that, like in your head, you're not thinking that they're sick or they're infectious. So it's a bit of a mental shift. Everybody we go to is sick. So we do see some fatigue as far as, adhering to some of this stuff in our workforce. I think the culture is pretty on board with, supporting each other just to get back on board with stuff like that. I'm not going to say that we're perfect, but I think generally the culture supports sticking with this stuff as much as possible. I think probably the most difficult part for first responders in general, and particularly when you're working on ambulance, is when the public aren't following guidelines. I think that's a huge ding to our morale, if you will, when we see that sort of thing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Andrew, what about you? Do you see that impacting your teams? Some following the protocols maybe very strictly, some less so, and how does that work when everybody gets back into work?
Yeah, I think there's definitely been an evolution throughout the pandemic. Quite honestly, very early on within our department, I think there was some hesitancy within our membership, or some segment of our membership, to wear a medical mask when they went to a routine call that didn't have any specific information about a COVID positive case or any other type of infectious disease, because it wasn't the norm. Police officers weren't adept to showing up to calls, putting on a blue mask and gloves and different types of PPE to respond to a quote unquote policing call. There has been a culture change, obviously, as we've navigated throughout the pandemic. New evidence has come forward, and we had to ensure that we showed the public that we would not only be protected from getting COVID and other infectious diseases, but we would also protect the public from potentially, passing that something on from one of our members. So we did, instill, a lot of policies, procedures in to our daily operational guidelines to ensure that all our members did have, minimum levels of PPE in different types of environments. And what was really important was to ensure that we got buy-in from our unions on the sworn and civilian side to make sure that they were on board with it as well, because there can be repercussions for first responders and especially police officers under different legislation for non-compliance policies as well. So we had to make sure that it was very robust. I would say we're much better now than we were 6 months ago with compliance. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Another really interesting question's come in, and I'm going to address it to you, Ryan. What about this concept of self-stigma? So what do you think about the impact of self-stigma, and does a person's self-image impact the ability to get help?
I think it really depends on the environment that you work in, and I've said it before. I think investing in mental health programs, resilient mind programs, before you get these black swan events that are going to create large mental health issues, by doing it early can help that self-stigma, that you're aware of it, you know how to react to it. It's really going to depend on the individual, and I think it's a case-by-case basis depending on the resiliency of the individual and at what point they're able to reach out.
Thank you. Mark, maybe you could explain a little bit exactly what self-stigma is and talk about that.
Well, that's an interesting thing, because one of the challenges is, I think, and WorkSafe, full kudos. I think the stuff that you've done with anti-stigma campaign has just really been significant. But what's really interesting is, if you are struggling with trauma or anxiety or depression, it's part of the syndrome. You self-stigmatize. So that's why we need to go even one step beyond just simply trying to get rid of. We've got to become even more proactive to look out for our sisters and brothers in the organizations we're in, right? And maybe that's the gift of COVID, believe it or not. COVID is not a respecter of persons. There was an anti-mask campaign in Steinbeck, Manitoba, and the next week, 40% of that community was infected, right? So one of the gifts of COVID is it doesn't matter what you believe, doesn't matter what the color of your skin is, what your religion is, you're susceptible to it. The truth is, we're all in this together, and it's really only people who are incredibly terrorized by it that kind of go with this belief system. No, I'm not. I'm above it. I'm above it. I'm above it. Well, we really are in it together. And if we can learn that about COVID, if COVID can teach us that, maybe it could also teach us that about mental health, because mental health, we're all in it together. We're all on the same playing field when it comes to that.
Excellent. I have to say that's the first time I've thought about and considered or heard anything about COVID, what COVID's given to us. That's a really interesting perspective. Thank you for that. Andrew, a question for you. With the constant change and uncertainty from the pandemic, what strategies can frontline leaders use to both address and quell the staff's fear and distrust of how their organization may be handling certain aspects of the pandemic? It's tough carrying both torches.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, touching on earlier, I think it was really incumbent on our frontline leadership to have buy-in to our departmental policies, our procedures, and basically our mission on how we were going to support our frontline staff, and to really disseminate that information to our frontline workers. One of the struggles was obviously the communication platforms. We couldn't have those face-to-face meetings early on. We had to find new ways to do it. It was really important for those frontline supervisors and middle management there to convey that message, to ensure that all the crucial information was disseminated to our staff, so they would really, I use that word again, buy in and really understand that we're doing these things because not only they're the right things, and they're legislated, but they're there to protect our members.
Thank you. Jane, can you talk a little bit about a buy-in and how did buy-in happen in your work environment?
I mean, in a lot of ways, I hate to say it, we didn't really have a lot of choice when you're working in healthcare. You know, we all recognized what the risk was with COVID, even though there was a lot of unknown at the beginning. We had understood innately just through our work the concept of an infectious disease and what this could mean. And particularly anybody who's been around long enough to have worked during H1N1, which is a poor frame of reference compared to this as far as work goes. But we had an understanding of what needed to be done, even though we didn't know how bad or where it was coming from or anything at the beginning of this. So I think the biggest concerns weren't so much buy-in of, you know, what to wear and how to, you know, go through all these procedures. It was fear because we didn't know, you know, are we going to have enough PPE, or are we going to be able to keep up with all these updates? You know, what kind of infection level are we dealing with here? And as it started to evolve, it started to dawn on us pretty quickly some of the moral dilemma and moral injury that we were going to be dealing with throughout this. A lot of our clinical processes have changed. A lot of the treatments we can provide have changed, or at least in the sense of how much work it takes to provide the same level of care. So I think buying into it wasn't the issue. I think we had a very stark realization and a lot of fear and dread over the impact it was going to have due to not being able to do business the way that we want to do as individuals, as human beings. So.
Thank you for that. I think you've brought up a really interesting and important concept here, which is moral injury. Mark, are you able to expand a little bit on what a moral injury is?
Yeah, again, sort of, I think we underestimate how huge that is. The American military estimates that 60% of all their soldiers, their PTSD is not traced to I'm going to die or I saw a friend die, which a lot of them do. It's 60% is traced to moral injury, which is that the world just hits us in such a, for lack of a better word, evil. It fractures our moral framework. As somebody once wrote, it's a bruise to the soul. It disillusions us about humanity, and it really throws us into kind of a tailspin about what's the meaning and purpose. Jane, again, at the very beginning said, you know, that my work has meaning. And I would say, as a resilient person who does a lot of work in resilience, I would say that meaning is one of the core things to build resilience, is that what I'm doing is I'm doing good, even when the world is incredibly evil and when it throws really negative things at me. If we can begin to talk about each other as heroes and contributing to humanity, kind of light versus dark, whatever analogy you want to use, that goes a long, long way to make us not resilient or not moral injury proof, but boy, it really puts some good armor on when you address it directly.
Thank you. Ryan, can you comment a little bit about moral injury in the fire service and any strategies you have to recommend?
Yeah, I think it's been challenging with COVID because responding to our calls has added another layer of PPE or you know, a protective layer that takes time. We talk about the golden hour and seconds count, where we get out of the station as quick as possible, you get to the patient as quick as possible. And now we've got this issue of, we know that person's in distress, but we need to take that extra time to protect ourselves. And I think there is that concern of moral injury of like, is it really that bad? Why don't we just get in there and go help that person instead of putting this gown on and all these different layers? And I can't see through this visor, it's fogging up. This is worse than it's good. And I think there's been a lot of challenges with COVID related to that on our, you know, our sworn obligations to help the community at the same time protecting ourselves. And what is that doing?
Yeah, excellent.
It's been hard mechanisms to sort of deal with it. You know, I think it rolls back to what we keep saying is, you know, putting into the context of realizing we're doing the best that we can in this environment.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting next question, and I'm going to start with you, Mark. Where does spiritual health fit in and connect to mental health in terms of self-understanding and coping?
Yeah, again, I think it's spiritual health is critical. Actually, psychology's suke, it's the direct translation is study of the soul. You know, so when we look about meaning and purpose in life, when we talk about gratitude, when we go, how do we make sense out of horrible suffering, particularly innocent suffering, which is, of course, has a lot to do with moral injury. Those things are critical. Mindfulness, meditation, faith, they provide meaning. And I frankly don't know how people get through being a first responder without constructing some sort of narrative that they give themselves about what this life is about and how they're contributing to it. I think there's a lot of research to that. One of the best books I could ever recommend would be Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz and writes about it. If you want to know what resilience is, here's a man who survived Auschwitz. Or The Choice is another woman who wrote, I forget her name offhand, but she wrote about surviving Auschwitz. So spirituality is absolutely critical to this.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up that. So I'll repeat it. It's Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And a lot of the things that you were talking about earlier about gratitude and having a sense of purpose and meaning made me think of that book. So an excellent reference. Andrew, I'm going to actually direct that question to you as well. Can you talk a little bit about the spiritual component of work for you?
Yeah, for sure. I think, you know, we've got such a diverse workforce within the VPD, and I think it is important. Everyone has different outlets, and faith is very an important part. I think, like a lot of other industries, the faith and the industry, you know, churches and different types of industries there have struggled throughout COVID because people couldn't gather, they couldn't go to worship, they couldn't do things like that, and like all of us, they had to kind of adapt and overcome to be able to still get the message out and to be able to support the people through different types of means. So definitely, I think it's been a struggle for both our sworn and civilian staff. You know, our members that were used to going to church every single week or going to different types of activities, they weren't able to do that. But you know, fortunately, you know, a lot of these institutions have leveraged online platforms to help our members away along the way.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Ryan, next question for you. What skills did your staff utilize for the in-the-moment adrenaline sprint? What skills were most effective at reducing stress hormones and adrenaline crash for the staff on the front line?
At the start, the sprint, it was it's kind of like a CNN situation room where the phone lines are going and information's coming and going. And for some of us, we thrive actually in that environment. But there comes a breaking point where you're like a hamster on a wheel. You can only go for so long. So, you know, talking to a lot of our members, what we found was just, you know, the side effect of COVID is that it caused people's family lives to slow down. Kids' events, things started getting canceled. And a lot of people talked about, you know what, this has been good at just spending time with my family, doing a puzzle, playing a game, throwing a ball instead of having to run around and be at all these different scheduled events. So I think like in the initial sprint phase was just being able to have that time with family or some kind of hobby that you could do at home. Sorry, what was the second part to that?
It's sort of reducing the adrenaline crash, right? So, I mean, you might spike with adrenaline and then everything's over and dealt with, and then you're crashing. And how do you manage that crash? Yeah,
I think we're crashing down a hill right now. We're just carrying on. I think, you know, hope, as we've spoken about, is important. So at first there was the hope of the vaccine. Are they going to get a vaccine? What are the chances? There's a race right now with a bunch of manufacturers. So I think that helped at the start. And now we're kind of clinging on to this hope of let's get these vaccines out as quick as possible. And I think where we're talking about the marathon and the potential for burnout now is I think there's a lot of people that know the finish line's there, hopefully, with vaccines, and it seems that it's going slow. It's like when you're almost home on a long weekend and you're close to your house and you're sitting in traffic, bumper to bumper traffic, and it's like, I'm almost there. So I think that's one of the issues there.
Yeah. Mark, I'm going to bring up something that you talked about previously, and that was the importance of having hope for the future, but not having a timeline for it. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, again, this comes out of the Auschwitz literature. And of course, Auschwitz hope is absolutely critical. And for sure, the prisoners were hoping for liberation. But a well-known phenomena that was well reported in the death camps was that people who date stamped hope that we'll be done, we'll be liberated on March 3rd, we'll be liberated on March 8th. When they date stamped it, when they had a very specific time in mind, if they weren't liberated by that, very frequently within a week or two, they would be dead, that their hope died with them. And so I think that's a cautionary tale. I put my hope, of course, in its ending, but really, honestly, where I put a lot of my hope is the fact that there's first responders, my heroes. They're tough as all get out. They are resilient. They do need some resilience training, but they're resilient by nature. And I really don't have any qualms about the fact that I don't know where the end line is going to get us through, but I know first responders, and they're going to get us there. And I have a lot of hope in that. So just that sort of Alcoholics Anonymous, one day at a time, we get through it.
I think that's a really important concept. So, I mean, I think it would be incorrect of us to think, okay, by September 1st, all vaccinations will be done and this will be over, right? Setting that timeline. It's more about continuing to have that hope as we go through this process. Yeah, thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. So question, I'll start with you, Andrew. Has the pandemic been the straw that's broken the camel's back in policing, paramedicine, or firefighting? And are people leaving their professions?
No, I don't. So definitely people, I don't think, as far as policing goes in the BPD, people aren't leaving the profession because of the pandemic. And in fact, I think, more than ever, people are not leaving the profession because they know they have that job to do. They're first responders for a reason, and this pandemic's not going to slow them down. Definitely, there's some stressors involved with the pandemic, and it's going to take its toll on our members once this is all said and done with. But no, I think there's been full buy-in from both our sworn and civilian staff. They want to be there on the front lines. They want to, provide the service, public safety to the citizens. Absolutely not. We just had to retool the way we do our business.
Thank you. Jane, what about you? Are you seeing from your position people are leaving paramedicine?
I think, like Andrew said, not right now. First responders are very galvanized right now, particularly paramedics. We're dealing with COVID head on, literally. I am concerned about the future. I think in dealing with a lot of my colleagues and listening to their stories and what they have to say, I think a lot of people have reached their limit of stress and burnout for various reasons throughout the pandemic. So looking forward, right now, no, but we are having higher rates of, I don't say book offs, but, people taking time for themselves because of the stress and mental health issues of this. And I'm quite frankly really concerned about what we're going to see when this is over, as far as people leaving and the mental health toll that this whole thing has taken. Like I was saying, I got myself into therapy for issues, but make no mistake, I'm not getting therapy right now for COVID because we're still in it, and everybody's in it and we're all taking a hit right now. So going forward, I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately.
Thank you. And last, Ryan, over to you. What about fire? Are people leaving?
No, I don't think so. I think if anything, I think people in the fire service feel fortunate that we have a stable career. I mean, a lot of our friends and family are out of work and trying to deal with COVID when you're dealing with bills that you can't pay and mortgages and things like that. So I don't think there's any concern around the fire service. I think this is what we've signed up for. I mean, right now it's COVID. It could be a major earthquake. This is this is what we're expected to do and signed up for. And I think our members, you know, we train constantly for big events, and I think we're in it right now. And I think that's what we're expected to do.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to ask you about some lessons that you've learned personally during COVID. So Jane, let's start with you. What's a personal lesson you've learned during this period?
I think the biggest lesson is human connection is really important to keep. We've lost so much of it over the last year, or had to alter so much of it. So I've really started to place a higher value, or at least appreciate more my connections with my colleagues and my friends, and also taking my personal time into account. That's had a much higher value as well, which really kind of gets you through some of the work stuff. And with patients as well, I mean, we've had a lot of changes with the way that we do business and the way we interact with patients, PPE being the main one. So the way that we interact with people, which is the whole purpose of our job, really, when you think about it, has changed. And not always for the better, but it's forced us to find ways to connect with people in different ways. And I used to say when the pandemic started, the hardest thing for me was actually giving death notifications wearing PPE. I just found it obscene. For whatever reason, having my face covered and having to tell people horrible news that way. But I actually found that a lot of the people that I was giving this horrible news to were reciprocating, feeling bad for me having to do this, which just really brought to light, you know, people are really putting themselves out there trying to connect more, even under the worst of circumstances. So I've just tried to focus on that.
Thank you. And I'm sorry to hear about such a sad example that you had to provide, but thank you for that. Andrew, how about you? A personal learning throughout this period?
Yeah, I think there's been so much learned throughout this pandemic, but I think, you know, for me, one of the lessons learned was that, you know, this has affected everyone a bit differently, and everyone's got different levels of resilience. And, you know, Jane kind of touched on just making sure that everyone has those coping strategies available to them, and that, you know, that we're able to support our members was so important throughout this pandemic. So, you know, for me, I was able to, you know, ensure that I had a kind of sound mind, and I was able to stay active and do different kind of things. But just, you know, being alive to the fact that everyone struggles in different ways, and to ensure that we're able to provide those supports to our frontline members so they could keep doing their job, you know, and that they were healthy both on and off the job.
Thank you. I think that's such an important point, that everyone has different levels of resilience and different ways of coping. And you know, it could be easy sometimes to compare yourself, you know, why isn't this person doing as well? But we don't know inside each other's heads. And, you know, the fact that you recognize that and are providing resources and supports is really great. Ryan, we're nearing the end of our conversation here, but one thing quickly from you in terms of a personal learning.
I think it's just not taking life for granted. It's really brought to the forefront of human connection, time with family, friends, connecting, how you can take that for granted and always have an excuse of being too busy. And when that's taken away from you, you realize how important that was in your life. And it just in the day-to-day things, how getting out there, or even one of the things that we've experienced is there's been 30 firefighters that have had line of duty deaths related to COVID. And just what our tradition has been is to go out and honor those families and those departments that are going through that difficult time, and we're not able to do that. And so it's really been, I think, a challenge to realize how much we take for granted. And once it's taken away, it really becomes pushed to the forefront. So that's my goal, be more connected after this.
Thank you. And Mark, how about you? A personal learning that's come through this time?
Yeah, there's been a bunch of things going on besides COVID, just some terminal illness in my family, and my mom being isolated and living in Sarnia has been really hard. So all of that everybody said. I read a phrase during the COVID that really struck me, and it was a New York Times op-ed. And the guy said, you know, most of my life I've worked on my resume. And he said, in the midst of this, I realized I really want to work on my eulogy. And that was just such a click for me, that I've been pretty driven. I've been, you know, I've really worked hard, spent long hours to my profession. And now just, it's really come into sharp focus that I'm really using this as a shift for me to who do I want to be for the rest of my life? What are my real values? And what do I really, really want to pursue? So working on my eulogy rather than my resume, I think is a really big thing for me.
That's a really interesting concept. I read a book once and it was titled something like, who do you want to be at your funeral? And it was sort of this concept of imagining your funeral and who would actually be there and why would they be there and what kind of social connections had we built with people so that people would be there. Yeah, very, very interesting. Okay, I'm looking for a 1 or 2 word answer from each of you. One piece of advice for leadership in these times. Andrew, go.
Wow, 1 or 2 words. I would say just, you know, lead by example and, you know, effectively communicate.
Thank you. Jane.
I echo that, lead by example, connect with your people, and build morale.
Thank you. Ryan?
I would say listen and communicate.
Listen and communicate. Thank you. And Mark?
I would simply say thank you. First responders, thank you. You're my heroes, and it's a privilege for me to have worked with you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, this concludes today's webinar. I'd like to acknowledge every attendee for your commitment to first responder mental health. I'd really like to thank today's speakers for the wisdom, the insight, the vulnerability that you shared with us today. I'd also like to thank the great team that worked on putting these webinars together. Everything from sourcing speakers to setting up the technology to registration and logistics. It's been a tremendous effort. And one thing that I know that I'm grateful for on a daily basis is the support that I have of the team from WorkSafe BC who's put this together, and the support from all the members of the BC First Responders Mental Health Committee in making this happen. You can expect to receive a short survey in March regarding the series, but in the meantime, if you have any specific feedback on today's session, please send an email to info@bcfirstrespondersmentalhealth.com. And I have to say, after our first webinar last week, we did get a number of emails about the webinar, really reinforcing the value that having this conversation around mental health is bringing to the first responder community. So thank you for that. Finally, we're taking a 1-week break with no session next Thursday. I hope that you'll join us on February 11th for our 3rd webinar in our speaker series, which is returning to work from a psychological injury, challenges and recommendations. Goodbye. Thank you very much. Have a safe and healthy day.